I want to catch up now with the Israeli ambassador to Australia, the acting Israeli ambassador to Australia, Jonathan Peled. Thanks for joining us, Jonathan. First up, let's talk about that issue of coverage. You must see the coverage right across the Western world as being pretty strongly anti-Israel in the Western media. Do you see that in Australia as well?
I think in Australia slightly less so, but evidently there is an obsession and some kind of an anti-Israeli wave, which is basically, it's based on a lot of incitement and a lot of disinformation. People who are really ignorant, don't know the facts, obviously like to side with the weaker side, but again, are not getting the story true right. And that's where you're doing such a good job in trying and giving a more biased approach to the conflict.
How do we get a more accurate view of the Palestinian people, mainstream Palestinian people? We know, of course, that they want statehood. We know, of course, that they'll be on the side of their own statehood. But how do we ever get an accurate view of what they think of Hamas taking this action, starting these conflicts, and obviously so many civilians on both sides paying a price? We can never be certain of what the true Palestinian view would be in Gaza or the West Bank.
In Gaza, definitely, because they're oppressed by their own Hamas government. They never elected Hamas into power. Hamas took over the Gaza Strip brutally. So they're afraid. I think the average Palestinian, obviously, I'm not talking about the ones that are currently now in danger's way, are afraid to speak up, are afraid to contradict Hamas because they know the consequences are very dire. And I think what even the Palestinians and definitely the Arabs in the region know that they are not Israel's enemy. Israel is not their problem. They have much more urgent problems, and Israel can be part of the solution and is not necessarily their problem. So really we have to just continue putting out our message. Yes, sorry.
Sorry to interrupt, but tell us about the response from Israel, though. It's got to be targeted and it's got to be proportionate. And we get a situation like this where people say it's not. There obviously are civilians that have been killed. Israel concedes that. Obviously, there's been a whole lot of targets that Israel have been looking at for a long while, and this is the pretext. Now you're determined to knock out as much of that militant infrastructure as you possibly can.
Absolutely. I mean, in Israel, there's criticism as well, of course. Being a democracy under the scrutiny of the free press and public opinion, there are many people in Israel who also are very much afraid of the consequences and feel for the Palestinian people in Gaza. The difference is that we target terrorists, they target civilians, and we're left with no option.
But you could pull back
to take these measures.
You could pull back at any time and stop the attacks, stop taking out the infrastructure you're after. Is it a case that at the moment Israel is hell-bent on degrading the weapons stockpiles in Gaza, that you believe that they're heavily stocked with Iranian missiles?
No, they're heavily stockpiled with Iranian missiles. We've just discovered 15 kilometers of underground tunnels, some of them near schools and mosques, in the center of their population. I don't think us putting a stop to it unilaterally is going to help us. We're not going to suffer less rockets and less attacks on our population. And the longer Hamas gets to call the shots, the more dangerous it's going to be not only for Israel, but for the Palestinians elsewhere, for the Arab states, and for the region in general. So I think it's a vested interest of all of us to put a stop to Hamas and degrade its capabilities.
So despite calls for a ceasefire now, what we are going to see is Israel finish its program of degrading those military stocks, those militant weapons stocks.
We're seeking calm and restraint, but we will not accept only a temporary ceasefire. We need to really achieve now a sustainable peace and quiet so that this doesn't recur again in a few months or 1 year down the road. But I hope very much that we can bring this to a very speedy end within the next couple of days, because we're not enjoying the situation either. To be a democracy under fire and in war is no fun job for anyone.
I want to get to the battle for statehood, the two-state solution that lies behind all these tensions, and have a look at what our former Australian Foreign Minister Bob Carr said on this station earlier today.
So if we're peeling back to the cause of the riots that we've seen in cities in Israel with a mixed Arab-Jewish population, or the tension in Jerusalem, we come to one very simple piece of Israeli behaviour, and that is the remorseless spread of settlements on occupied Palestinian land.
Acting Ambassador, we hear that argument a lot. Are you surprised to hear it from a former Australian Foreign Minister?
It saddens me to hear this, obviously. He's forgetting the context, the history behind it all, the fact that Israel accepted a two-state solution, accepted the partition plan. We always wanted to have an Arab state living side by side with Israel. It's the Arab side that has never accepted it. It's the Palestinians that are not coming back to the negotiating table. So it's very easy to blame Israel, but the other side has to look at himself very carefully and say, what have they done, or better, what have they not done to reach this situation where we are in a continuous hostility and having to fight off terrorists and extremists like Hamas. By the way, there's Hamas in the south, there's Hezbollah in the north, and they're hijacking the Palestinian cause. They're not doing the Palestinians any favors. They're not advancing their cause, their statehood, their peace, their quiet, only the contrary.
Traditionally, there's been strong bipartisan support in this country for Israel. You'd be aware of that. With comments like that from Bob Carr, do you believe that that has weakened now, that Labor is less supportive of Israel than it has been?
We've always enjoyed the bipartisan support in Australia, and I truly believe that we'll continue to have it. We have good friends on both sides of the aisle, and the important thing is to keep the dialogue open, to express and explain our points of view. We can sometimes disagree on certain issues, but the steadfast support of Australia, of Australian governments over the years for Israel. May I remind you that this special bond dates back to World War I, the Anzacs. So, I mean, Australia is deeply committed to the state of Israel, to the Jewish state, to its defense and its right to defend itself. And I'm confident that it'll continue to be so.
Jonathan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Chris, for having me.
Jonathan Peled there, who's the acting Israeli ambassador in Australia. Just a terrible situation in the Middle East. But as you heard from what he had to say there, Israel will be taking out as many of those weapons as they can now that the Hamas militants have started firing off those rockets. The Hamas terrorists, I should say, have started attacking Israeli citizens. Just a shocking situation.